Richard Langley was rich, very rich, but money couldn't fix everything. He stood alone in his big, fancy office late at night. Outside, the city lights sparkled like stars, but inside, Richard felt empty. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was another message from a detective he'd hired to find his missing daughter, Emily. "No luck," the text read. Richard sighed deeply. 2 years had passed since Emily disappeared. She left without saying goodbye, and Richard knew why. He had been too busy chasing success, building his business empire, and forgetting about the people who mattered most, his family. His wife, Margaret, had already left him years ago. She couldn't take his coldness anymore. And now Emily was gone too. Richard blamed himself for both losses. Every day, he thought about her laugh, her smile, and how he hadn't been there for her. Tonight, he decided something. He wouldn't stop looking for Emily. No matter what it took, he would find her. Little did he know, his search would lead him to answers he never expected, and change his life forever. Richard's mind raced as he stared out the window. Memories of Emily flooded back. He remembered her as a little girl, running to hug him after school. Back then, she loved him so much, but as she grew older, their bond weakened. Arguments replaced laughter. Richard always thought he was giving her the best life. Expensive schools, designer clothes, everything money could buy. But Emily didn't want those things. She wanted her dad. Now, sitting in his lonely penthouse, Richard realized he'd made a huge mistake. Money wasn't enough. Success wasn't enough. What good was all of it if he lost the people he loved? The clock ticked past midnight. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhausted but determined. Tomorrow he would try again. He would search every corner of the city if he had to. He owed it to Emily and to himself to make things right. As he turned off the lights and headed to bed, one thought stayed with him. Somewhere out there, Emily was waiting. And maybe, just maybe, finding her would help him find himself too. The next morning, Richard woke up early. He didn't bother with breakfast or his usual routine. His mind was focused on one thing: finding Emily. Over the past 2 years, he had spent millions hiring private detectives, using high-tech tools, and even offering huge rewards for information. But nothing worked. Every lead ended in disappointment. This time, though, something felt different. As he scrolled through his emails, an anonymous message caught his eye. It was short and simple. "If you're really looking for your daughter, try the old shelter on 5th Street. Richard frowned. Anonymous tips were common, but most were fake. Still, this one stood out. The mention of a specific place, the old shelter, made him curious. Could it be real, or just another dead end? He decided to check it out. After all, what did he have to lose? When Richard arrived at the shelter, he felt out of place. The streets smelled of dampness and decay. People sat on sidewalks holding cardboard signs. Inside the building, volunteers handed out food and blankets. Richard adjusted his expensive coat, feeling uncomfortable. This world was so far removed from his own. He approached a woman organizing supplies. "Excuse me," he said, trying to sound calm. "I'm looking for someone. My daughter. Have you seen her?" The woman shook her head. "Sorry, sir. Lots of people come through here. Hard to keep track." Richard's heart sank. Just another dead end. He turned to leave when suddenly, he heard voices near the entrance. A small crowd had gathered around 2 figures sitting on the ground. One was a young woman with messy blonde hair. The other was an older woman wrapped in a tattered blanket. Richard froze. The young woman looked familiar. Was it Emily? He squinted, his pulse quickening. She wasn't facing him directly, but her profile matched Emily's. Blonde hair, slim build, it had to be her. Beside her, the older woman caught his attention too. There was something about her eyes, kind yet piercing, as if she could see right through him. Richard couldn't explain it, but she seemed familiar somehow. His hands trembled as he took a step closer. "Emily?" he called out softly. The young woman turned her head slowly. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then she looked away, whispering something to the older woman. Richard's heart raced. It was Emily. But why was she here? And who was the older woman? Before he could approach, the older woman spoke. Her voice was calm but firm. "You must be Richard," she said, almost like she already knew him. Richard blinked in confusion. Do I know you?" The woman smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, she placed a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. Richard wanted to rush forward, to hug Emily and beg her to come home. But something stopped him. The way the older woman looked at him, it was like she was guarding Emily from him. For the first time in years, Richard felt powerless. Richard stood frozen, his mind racing. The young woman beside the older one was definitely Emily. He could see it now. The shape of her face, the faint freckles on her cheeks. But she looked so different from the last time he'd seen her. Her clothes were worn, her hair tied back messily. She seemed thinner, more fragile. Yet there was a calmness about her that he didn't recognize. The older woman watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "You must be Richard," she repeated, her voice steady. "Yes," Richard replied, his voice cracking slightly. "And you are?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "You can call me Sister Mary." "Sister Mary?" Richard echoed, confused. Was she a nun? A volunteer? Something about her felt familiar, but he couldn't place it. Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Her tone startled him. It wasn't angry or cold. It was cautious, almost guarded. Richard swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "I've been looking for you, Emily, for 2 years. I thought something terrible had happened to you." Emily glanced at Sister Mary, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Then she turned back to Richard. "I'm fine, Dad. I left because I needed to figure some things out. Things I couldn't do while living your life." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "My life? What's wrong with my life?" Emily sighed, shaking her head. "It's not real, Dad. None of it is. The money, the fancy cars, the big house. It's all just empty. I wanted something real. Something meaningful." Richard opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. Deep down, he knew she was right. His wealth hadn't brought him happiness. It had only driven people away. Sister Mary interrupted gently. "Emily has been helping us here at the shelter. She's found purpose in serving others. Isn't that worth more than any amount of money?" Richard looked at her, stunned by her words. There was wisdom in her voice, a quiet strength that reminded him of someone. "But who?" "I don't understand," he admitted. "Why would you choose this life? You could have anything you want. Comfort, security." Emily cut him off. "That's the problem, Dad. I don't want those things. Not if they come at the cost of being human. Here I've learned what really matters: kindness, connection, making a difference. That's something your money can't buy." Her words stung, but they also made sense. Richard felt ashamed of himself, of the life he'd built. He looked at Sister Mary again, searching for answers in her calm gaze. "Who are you?" he asked suddenly. "You seem familiar." Sister Mary smiled faintly. "Maybe we've met before. Or maybe you're just seeing something in me that reminds you of yourself." Her answer frustrated him. "No, there's something. I know you from somewhere." She didn't respond, instead turning her attention back to Emily. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Emily nodded. "I'll be fine." Richard felt like an outsider watching their bond. It was clear that Sister Mary meant a lot to Emily. But why? And how had they even met? Before he could ask more questions, Sister Mary stood up. "Come back tomorrow, Richard," she said firmly. "If you really want to understand, come back and listen. Don't try to fix things right away. Just listen." With that, she walked away, leaving Richard standing there with Emily. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Can we talk, Emily? Please." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but not today. Come back tomorrow." As Richard left the shelter, his mind was spinning. He had found Emily, but she was nothing like the daughter he remembered. And Sister Mary, who was she? Why did she feel so familiar? One thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Richard returned to the shelter earlier than he intended. He couldn't sleep the night before, his mind replaying every word Emily and Sister Mary had said. Something about Sister Mary gnawed at him, a faint memory tugging at the edges of his consciousness. He needed answers. When he arrived, Sister Mary was already there, sitting on a bench outside the shelter. She looked up as he approached, her calm gaze meeting his. "You came back," she said simply. "I did," Richard replied. "I need to understand. Who are you? Why does Emily trust you so much?" Sister Mary studied him for a moment before speaking. "Maybe it's not about me. Maybe it's about what I represent." "What do you mean?" "I represent a life you've forgotten, or maybe never knew. A life where people matter more than money, where kindness matters more than success." Her words struck a chord in Richard, but they didn't answer his question. "That's all well and good, but it doesn't explain why you seem so familiar to me." She hesitated, then sighed softly. "Richard, sit down. There's something I need to tell you." He obeyed, his heart pounding. Whatever she was about to say, he could feel it was important. "When I first saw you yesterday," she began, "I recognized you immediately, but I wasn't sure if you'd recognize me." "Recognize you?" Richard frowned. "Why wouldn't I?" Then it hit him. The way she spoke, the shape of her eyes, the scar on her finger where her wedding ring used to be. His breath caught in his throat. "Margaret," he whispered. She nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, Richard. It's me." For a moment he couldn't speak. His mind raced with questions, memories, and emotions he hadn't felt in years. Margaret, his wife, the woman he loved, the woman who walked out on him, was alive. And she had been living as Sister Mary this whole time. How is this possible?" he stammered. "I thought you were gone. You thought I left because I didn't love you anymore?" Margaret finished for him. "No, Richard. I left because I did love you. But I couldn't live the way we were living. Not anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean the emptiness, the coldness between us. You were so focused on building your empire that you forgot about us, about me, about Emily. I tried to tell you, but you didn't listen. So I left, hoping you'd realize what really mattered." Richard's chest tightened. "And when I didn't come after you, I started over," she said quietly. "I found purpose helping others. It gave me peace. But I never stopped loving you, Richard. Or Emily." Tears streamed down his face now. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me know you were alive?" "Because I needed to see if you'd change," she admitted. "But instead, you became even more consumed by your work." Then Emily disappeared, and I realized she'd followed the same path I had, running from a life she couldn't bear. Richard shook his head, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry, Margaret, for everything." She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not too late, Richard. You can still fix things, with Emily, with yourself. But you have to be willing to change." Before he could respond, Emily appeared. She stopped short when she saw them together, her eyes widening. "Dad? What's going on?" Richard stood up, wiping his tears. "Emily, there's something I need to tell you. This woman, she's not just Sister Mary. She's your mom." Emily stared at Margaret, shock written all over her face. "Mom?" Margaret nodded, smiling through her own tears. "Hi, sweetheart." For a long moment no one spoke. Then Emily ran forward, throwing her arms around Margaret. Richard watched, his heart breaking and healing all at once. As the three of them stood together, Richard made a silent promise. He would do whatever it took to make things right, for Margaret, for Emily, and for himself. Over the next few weeks, Richard spent more time at the shelter than in his office. At first, it was awkward. Emily and Margaret were hesitant to let him into their world. But slowly, they began to trust him again. Richard listened to their stories, helped serve meals, and even rolled up his sleeves to clean up after meals. It wasn't glamorous work, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Margaret watched him closely, gauging whether his change was genuine. One evening, as they sat together on the shelter steps, she finally spoke. "You've been different lately, Richard." What made you decide to stick around? He looked at her, his expression serious. You did. Both of you. I realized I'd spent my whole life chasing success, thinking it would make me happy. But all it did was push the people I love away. I don't want to lose you again, Margaret. Or you, Emily. Margaret smiled faintly. It's not just about us, Richard. You have a chance to make a bigger difference, to use your wealth and influence to help others. Her words sparked an idea in Richard's mind. The next day, he called a meeting with his financial advisors and lawyers. By the end of the week, he had established the Langley Foundation, dedicated to supporting homelessness, education, and job training programs. He poured millions into the foundation, naming it after Margaret. The impact was immediate. New shelters opened across the city, offering not just beds but counseling and job placement services. Schools in low-income neighborhoods received funding for better resources. People who had been struggling for years suddenly had opportunities they never dreamed of. Richard didn't stop there. He began volunteering regularly, working alongside Margaret and Emily. For the first time, he understood what it meant to truly connect with people. Not as a billionaire handing out charity, but as a human being sharing their struggles and triumphs. One day, while helping a young man fill out a job application, Richard felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Emily. Dad? She said softly. Can we talk? They stepped outside, sitting on the same bench where Richard had first spoken to Margaret. Emily hesitated before speaking. I've been thinking about everything. About you, Mom, and how much has changed. And, Richard prompted gently, I'm proud of you, Dad. Really. You're not the same person you used to be. But, she paused, searching for the right words. I still need time to figure out who I am, apart from you and Mom. Does that make sense? Richard nodded, understanding completely. Of course, Emily. I won't rush you. Just promise me one thing. What's that? That you'll let me be part of your life, even if it's just a little bit at a time. Emily smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. I promise. As weeks turned into months, Richard continued rebuilding his relationships with Margaret and Emily. They weren't perfect. There were still moments of tension and uncertainty, but they were healing. Margaret moved into a modest apartment nearby, continuing her work at the shelter while allowing Richard to visit regularly. Emily stayed at the shelter longer, determined to finish what she started before considering her next step. Through it all, Richard learned humility. He stopped measuring his worth by his bank account and started valuing the connections he made with others. His employees noticed the change too. He became a kinder boss, more willing to listen and support his team. One evening, as Richard joined Margaret and Emily for dinner at Margaret's apartment, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. They laughed together, shared stories, and talked about the future. You've come a long way, Richard, Margaret said warmly. I couldn't have done it without you, he replied. Both of you. Emily grinned. Just don't get too soft on us. Okay? We still need you to keep funding the foundation. They all laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth. For the first time in years, Richard felt like he belonged. To a family, to a purpose, to a life worth living. Months passed, and Richard's life transformed in ways he never imagined. The Langley Foundation grew rapidly, becoming a beacon of hope for countless families across the city. Homeless shelters turned into thriving community centers, offering not just shelter but pathways to stability. Schools flourished with new resources, and job training programs helped people rebuild their lives. But the biggest change wasn't in the foundation, it was in Richard himself. He no longer lived solely for wealth or success. Instead, he found joy in simple moments. Sharing meals with Margaret and Emily, volunteering at the shelter, and seeing the smiles of those whose lives he touched. One crisp autumn evening, Richard stood outside the newly renovated shelter on 5th Street. It had been the same place where he first saw Emily sitting with Margaret. Now it gleamed with fresh paint, warm lighting, and a sign that read Langley House. Margaret joined him, wrapping a scarf around her neck. It looks beautiful, she said softly. It does, Richard agreed. But none of this would have happened without you. You saved me, Margaret. Both of you did. She smiled, leaning into him slightly. "We just gave you a chance to save yourself." Inside, Emily was busy helping organize a celebration for the shelter's grand reopening. She waved when she saw them, her face glowing with pride. Richard felt a surge of gratitude for her strength, for Margaret's wisdom, and for the second chance they'd given him. Later that night, as they sat together in Margaret's cozy apartment, Richard reflected on how far they'd come. "Do you remember the first time I came to the shelter?" he asked. Emily chuckled. "How could I forget? You looked completely out of place." "I was," Richard admitted, "but finding you both changed everything. I used to think my money defined me. Now I know it's the people we love and the lives we touch that really matter." Margaret reached over, squeezing his hand. "You've grown so much, Richard. I'm proud of you." Her words meant more to him than any business deal or financial milestone ever had. For the first time in years, Richard felt whole. As the evening drew to a close, Emily stood up, stretching. "Well, I should get going. Early shift tomorrow." "You're staying here tonight," Margaret insisted. "No arguments." Emily rolled her eyes playfully but didn't protest. Richard watched them banter, feeling a warmth in his chest. This was what family was supposed to feel like, safe, loving, and real. Before heading to bed, Richard stepped onto the balcony, gazing at the city skyline. The lights still sparkled, but they didn't seem as distant as they once did. He thought about all the people sleeping under those stars, the ones who now had a better chance because of the work they'd done. For so long, Richard had chased success, thinking it would fill the void inside him. But standing there, surrounded by the love of his family and the knowledge that he'd made a difference, he finally understood. True success wasn't measured in dollars or deals. It was measured in hearts healed, lives changed, and bonds restored. As he turned to go back inside, Richard smiled. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not just for himself but for the future. And that was enough.